So this is effective feedback models with a focus on peer and self-assessment. My name is Hannah Page, and I'm going to be delivering the session today. And I am a specialist leader in education for assessment. I was appointed, I think, in 2016. All the years just kind of blend into one after a pandemic, don't they? I have been an assistant head teacher at my school for 6 years, and before I had my daughter, I was an acting deputy head for a school in our trust, which was an amazing experience. Both of those roles were with the remit of assessment and feedback, and taking a priority role over those. Assessment and feedback are two things I have an absolute passion for. I know a lot of you will be sitting there going, oh no. Somebody's got to have a passion for it, guys. And I think it's if we get those right, they can make a massive impact on the children and make our workload much easier. And in a profession where we've constantly got to have so many plates spinning, I think it's really important that we get those big chunks right. So that's a little bit about me. So some key points, first of all, about assessment, because this feedback and peer and self-assessment kind of feeds into the overarching view on assessment. So some key points for all assessments. So are assessments relevant? Namely, do they enable you to understand how well pupils are performing against the curriculum studied at the particular point that pupils are at within their curriculum? So are they at their age and stage? And when we think about peer and self-assessment, it's really important that we think about what we're asking those children to assess and look for within their work, and that actually it has a purpose. That we're not just asking them to fill in a tick sheet about what they've done well for no reason, that we actually do something with it, which feeds into the next point, which is, do assessments provide meaningful insights? So in other words, does the data or the information that you collect help inform and support pupils' learning moving forward? Again, with peer and self-assessment, it's not just about doing the tick sheet and sticking the tick sheet in the book and then moving on with learning. It's about using it to help you develop your planning and actually for the children to use it to help them develop their learning, which then feeds into, are you using the assessment data effectively? So any data or information about their learning that you or the children collect, is it being used purposefully, and are you using it to adapt and put into action points that you learn from the assessment? So the NFER, the National Foundation for Educational Research, talk about formative assessment, and formative assessment takes place on a day-to-day basis during teaching and learning, allowing teachers and pupils to assess attainment and progress more frequently. It begins with diagnostic assessment, indicating what is already known and what gaps may exist in skills or knowledge. If a teacher and pupil understand what has been achieved to date, it is easier to plan next steps. And that's a real key point when it comes to peer and self-assessment. If a teacher and pupil understand what has been achieved to date, it is easier to plan next steps. So this is where that peer and self-assessment kind of forms into that formative assessment. Goes on to say that as the learning continues, further formative assessments indicate whether teaching plans need to be amended to reinforce or extend learning. Formative assessments may be questions, tasks, quizzes, or more formal assessments. Often, formative assessments may not be recorded at all, except perhaps in the lesson plans drawn up to address the next steps indicated. I don't know where you're all at in terms of where your schools, how your schools ask for planning. Some schools use journals. Certainly within our trust, we use a planning journal, so we might make notes on how a lesson went today and what we need to do differently tomorrow. Some of you may be filling in formal planning grids, but it's about kind of using that assessment and that kind of knowledge of the learning that's going on to move learning forward. It is possible for a summative assessment to be completed with materials that help teachers to analyse the results to inform teaching and learning, therefore also having formative benefits. If I look at the summative assessment outline, again by the NFER, summative assessment sums up what a pupil has achieved at the end of a period of time relative to the learning aims and the relevant national standards. The period of time may vary depending on what the teacher wants to find out, and there may be an assessment at the end of a topic, at the end of a term or half term, or at the end of a year, or in the case of national curriculum tests, at the end of a key stage. They often feel a lot more high stakes. If I think about summative assessment, as an assessment leader, I tend to think about the SATs. But depending on how you use the information and when you're using that peer and self-assessment, it could be considered summative, not just formative. A summative assessment may be a written test, an observation, a conversation, or a task, and it may be recorded through writing, through photographs, or other visual media, or through an audio recording. I think that's really important when we think about early years, who often do a lot of their assessment that way. Whichever medium is used, the assessment will show what has been achieved, and it will summarise attainment at a particular point in time, and may provide individual and cohort data that will be useful for tracking progress and for informing stakeholders, the governors, parents. Often summative data, particularly around the national key stage tests, goes off to the local authority, or DFE and Ofsted also use it to look at. Essentially, those big chunks of text come down to these two things: formative assessment and summative assessment. The formative is the assessment for learning. Okay, it's responsive teaching. It's your day-to-day bread and butter. Most of you are doing this without even thinking. It's when you talk to the children, it's when you discuss with them how their learning's going, what they could have done better in that piece of work, or when they've drawn a beautiful picture, what's positive about it, what skills could they improve to change the tone, perhaps if they were looking at art. I know we've got a geography teacher among us, so what vocabulary have they used to describe that geographical content? What haven't they used that they could use to improve it? So it's quizzes, observations, classwork and homework, pupil discussions, questioning. And the summative assessment is kind of tests at the end of a unit, statutory assessments, half-term levelling. I know some of you right now will be thinking about data drops as such, but both of them at their basic inform learning and are used for feedback. Both are needed to assist in future planning. Now, peer and self-assessment is a wonderful tool to help you do that. So for me, peer and self-assessment is the most effective when it falls into that formative assessment category. They are tools that support the children in developing an understanding of where they are and where they need to go within learning. Peer and self-assessment is not a free pass for feedback, I'm afraid, and I know that I'm all for making the workload easier, and it might mean that you're not sitting there for ages marking in depth a piece of work, but you do still need to have an overview of the learning, and you still need to ensure that you check in with pupils to make sure that actually they have accurately found what they've done well, they have accurately identified what they need to do next in their learning. Because if you're not checking in, then that's where one of the pitfalls is, that actually that becomes pointless because they've not done it right. To be effective, they have to be planned for and managed well within lessons, and not just at the end. And they are both incredibly powerful tools when used well. So what I have here is a video of Dylan William. Now, Dylan William is a professor of education. So what Dylan William goes on to talk about is how, when we look at peer assessment, what we naturally assume is that the children are going to look at their own work and that the teachers don't have to. And that actually what we are actually wanting our children to do is really look quite closely at the learning that is going on, and we want our children to be really aware of what they needed to have achieved within that lesson. So we're actually using them as tools for learning in their own right, and developing those skills around evaluativeness, and developing that sense of what makes a good piece of work. So what does assessment currently look like in your room? How has thus far any peer or self-assessment that you've done look, and how has it impacted your learners thus far? And what does it mean for any future practice, or for what you want to achieve out of today's session, perhaps?
So I do quite a lot of self-assessment, in that I get children to mark their own work as we go through the answers of things. And then I'll give them time, especially in writing, and say what you've not quite got right today. Normally as a plenary, they then have time to go back and look at it. So I've almost directed them as exactly what to look at. But in terms of peer assessment and evaluating their own or each other's work, I honestly don't actually think I've ever done it.
Okay. Thank you for your honesty. And I think you'll get a lot from some of the elements further on in this session.
I think when I've done it, I think some subjects it lends itself to more. So I think maths, because there is an answer, it's very easy for them to see when they're right or wrong. Whereas I suppose in English, when they've got a piece of work, it's very easy for them to lose the focus of what they're looking for, or think something's right when it's not quite right, and then they can think they've covered something but they haven't.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things on that, Tom, is that whilst it's easy for them to see what they got right in maths, sometimes it's difficult for them to see where they went wrong. So I know that when I've looked in books in the past, certainly within lessons that I've seen, they might just mark a question as wrong within maths, and that's just their response. I got it wrong. So we use pink and green pen. The pink is they highlight if they got it right. And the green is something that they need to improve, and often they just highlight the whole question green. But we know as mathematicians in our own rights that they necessarily didn't get every element of that question wrong. Certainly if it's a multi-step problem, they may well have only gone wrong at one particular point. So I think it's about that kind of training in not just, oh, I got the whole thing wrong. Well, actually, you possibly didn't. You possibly only went wrong at one particular point, and it's about training them to identify where in that calculation did the error occur. So thanks, that's a really good point there, Tom.
I'd just like to say, Hannah, I totally agree with what you've said. You know, as a maths teacher myself, it's one of the things I've always did, especially when we got up to GCSE or anything else, just say to them, right, have you got the first line? Okay, so they get one, you know, they've got that stage. Have they got this line? We'll write it through. Can you see this stage? And actually that's great for teaching, because then the students are looking for, and I say, well, how many steps did you get right? And they start counting the steps, and then we start looking at each of them. Have you got something similar to this? And then we can discuss other people's methods. So it's actually a brilliant learning tool. So I totally agree.
Yeah. Anyone else want to share?
This is another like something else I mentioned earlier. It's one of my focuses at the moment. I did it with year 4. We had to do a peer assessment on English, and I was surprised actually at how much they were picking up. You know, they were picking up the fact that you've used the word altogether, or whatever it was, quite a bit, and that was quite helpful. I think it didn't seem quite as judgmental coming from another child. Obviously it differs in which year group you're in, and we've tried doing self-assessment in year 2, but you know, things like, well, you've got full stops missing. No, they'll just start randomly putting the full stops anywhere because they haven't quite grasped that concept. So I've had sort of hit and miss experiences with it, perhaps.
So if I kind of move on to my next slide. So first of all, when it comes to peer and self-assessment, the first thing I've always done is peer assessment. I've always gone to that one first, and it's always been my first step, because children do love to spot the areas for improvement in someone else's work. You can 100% guarantee that if you make a mistake on that board, they will spot it when you make it, and they will spot it when a friend makes it. So the Education Endowment Fund identified 6 recommendations within its work around feedback, and the research and its recommendations are published online, and wherever I've taken knowledge and information from other sources, I've referenced it below. So they say plan for how pupils will receive and use feedback, and that's one of the ways to make feedback most effective. So careful thought should be given to how pupils receive feedback. Pupil motivation, self-confidence, and their trust in the teacher and their capacity to receive information can impact on the effectiveness of it. Teachers should therefore implement strategies that encourage learners to welcome feedback and should monitor whether pupils are using it. Teachers should also provide opportunities for pupils to use feedback. Only then will the feedback loop be closed so that pupils' learning can progress. So I think it's about creating a culture around feedback, and that comes from us. And this should be in place before we start implementing peer and self-assessment in order for it to be effective. So how we model giving feedback to our pupils is really, really important. So to be able to assess both peer and self, children need to be positive and open-minded. They need to be able to be constructive, but also be specific in their feedback. And that kind of comes back to some of the points around, you know, often one of the feedbacks that we get is it should have been neater. You know, the handwriting could have been nicer, which actually isn't always the learning intent. In some year groups it is, but in others it's not. So they need to be constructive and specific about it. It needs to be focused on the learning outcomes, as I just said. It needs to be evaluative and reflective. You need to be able to be trusted and trusting, and you need to be resilient. There's a resilience around receiving feedback and knowing that all feedback is good feedback, even if it's an area for improvement. So there are some things that support in that. So I'm sure that you've all heard of Carol Dweck and growth mindset and being open to making errors. So as a school, we've done a lot of work, and as a trust, we've done a lot of work around a growth mindset and accepting that we can't get everything right and that mistakes are part of the journey, that we need to make mistakes in order to learn. And often our fallback to that is that, you know, a child, when they're learning to walk, doesn't just get up and walk. It falls down a lot on its journey. Some other work, developing 6-hat thinking, and really developing some of the skills around processes and evaluating and looking at how things are organised. Those are all great things when it comes to looking at our work, and really important skills that we've got embedded first. As teachers, we need to plan for misconceptions. So we need to know where the errors are going to be so that we can inform the children where they're likely to go wrong. And that might sound a little strange, because in my head, as I say it, I think, well, if you're going to tell them where they're likely to go wrong, hopefully they won't go wrong there. They still will, because they make mistakes, they're children. But if they know where they're looking for errors, then they're more likely to spot them and less likely to make them again. We need to model formative feedback. So that comes from how you deliver feedback. And as a school, where I work currently, we don't do written feedback as class teachers. We do oral feedback. So verbally, we speak to the children as we walk around the lesson, and we tell the children what they've done really well, and have a dialogue with them. So some children we might tell, some children we might ask and say, what have you done really well here? You know, show me where you've done a great sentence in English, or show me where you've chronologically put things in order if I'm thinking of a history content, or geographically, you know, can you show me where you've successfully labelled those ordnance survey coordinates or some such thing. And we discuss with them and get them to highlight in pink where they've done that within their work, and then we might ask them to suggest an area to improve. You might model it with your TA. So we are a talk for writing school, so often we model the writing of a narrative, for example, and we might ask that that as the teacher's writing, or as the TA is writing, that we model what a great sentence is, or highlight a sentence to improve, or highlight where we've missed punctuation. And again, the children love telling you if you've missed it in a shared piece. Bloom's taxonomy and the different types of questions, and really thinking about the order of those questions and including those in some of the modelled feedback that you're doing, and then giving clear guidelines around feedback is really important. So as a school, I'm sure you've all got feedback policies, so marking or feedback policies that tell you what you need to be looking for in order to help a child make progress. Our children see that in action, but could they perhaps maybe form their own, maybe a class charter? In the past, we formed a class charter around what good feedback looks like when we're assessing ourselves and assessing one another. And then the kind of cornerstone of it all is sharing with the children what that success looks like. So along with those misconceptions, but sharing what a good one looks like, sharing what's going to make them successful in the lesson, what things do they need to have included, so that when they're assessing themselves or their peers, they actually have something to look for. So I've got up on my screen, and I'm hoping you can all see it. I'm hoping they don't appear too small. The planning for peer assessment. So some ideas to get going. So create a target. Ask the children to share their work with a critical friend, and then they can create a next step for them. I love the phrase a critical friend, and I heard it a long time ago. I think it really encourages them to be reflective and evaluative, and also nice in how they're delivering that constructive feedback. So working in pairs, get the children to swap books with another pair and then discuss the work that they've completed against the success criteria. Again, it keeps coming back to that success criteria. You'll see from this rather colourful one over here, it's a peer marking and self-review of a piece of writing. So I've listed down the side the features that I would expect to see. So conjunctions or connectives, that was during the time where we were transitioning from one phrase to another. And I've given some examples, furthermore, moreover, on the other hand. And then there's a little column that says I can see it and my critical friend can see it. Sometimes seeing if you can see it and then asking my critical friend kind of makes it a little bit easier for that message to be shared. Two-way sentences, a simile, alliteration, these will all have been things that when I think back to that planning stage for that piece of writing, that I'll have thought they need to include that to be successful. So it's really important that we keep linking back to that whenever we do any type of peer or self-assessment, that we keep directing the children back to what they needed to have done to be successful. So I've also got some really simpler ones, so ones I've used for homework presentations in the past, so 3 stars and a wish, or an even better if. The other thing that children can do with this is they could do it anonymously. I've done that before and that's quite nice. And again, if you've got that foundation and maybe that class charter in, you know, what do we consider to be good feedback, then doing it anonymously, you know, you're not going to get anyone saying anything that isn't constructive. So if I move on to my next slide. In certain year groups, there's a huge amount of data and information already out there to help you with peer assessment and so on. So you'll see from the screen here that I've got, if I'm working towards the expected level, I should be doing the following. And if I'm working at age related, I will do the following. And this is them again. I think I have it, and my critical friend agrees. And then again, I've done that on the other side. And these are, if there are any year 6 teachers among us, these are the end of key stage expectations. I have in the past changed these into child-friendly language. However, having said that, they all need to know this technical vocabulary for the year 6 SPAG test anyway. So now we just use it in its original form. At Chantry, we've also amended these so that the year 4 and year 5 can use them. After all, they are end of key stage expectations. And then you'll see from the little image in the corner that there's a discussion text toolkit. So we're a talk for writing school. And when you develop those toolkits with the children, we just print those off as a tick sheet to say whether they have or haven't included them. Again, using that phrasing of a critical friend. Anyone got any questions on any of that so far? Has anyone used anything similar?
Would you print them out for them to like stick in their books underneath? Because we do, when we do we've only just introduced it recently with the talk for writing, obviously you can understand.
Yeah.
What we started to do is after the innovation right and the invention right, we gave them that. I suppose it's more important with the innovation right because they can look through and see what they actually remembered to keep in from the key features of the text.
Yeah.
So we've been using like that, but that's quite nice across the board, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, and I would have them printed. In the past, and I think I've even got it on my self-assessment. In the past, I've done this as I think I have done it, and then in the next box, my teacher agrees. So that you then go through, and certainly in year 6, I know that that's quite a good one when it comes to moderation and getting the children. But with the toolkit, that's something that you've all got. So you form those toolkits together, what's in that text. So yeah, I would definitely have that printed. And actually, I think in one of the pictures coming up, Tom, I've actually got where the child has filled it in. So it's already in their book.
Yeah, that's what we've just started to introduce, because we were going through it and saying, have you got this, have you got that, whereas we're actually formalising. What we're going to start doing is, like you said, start with peers, so they swap books with someone of a similar standard to what they are, and then they can look at for the similar kind of things and hopefully see things that they should have added in, and what they might see it from that side as well.
Yeah, and it's lovely to do it with somebody of a similar, but the power it can that it can do if you perhaps took a higher attaining child with a child of an expected standard, because they are then sharing each other's work and looking at each other's, and that expected child then has the view of a work that's slightly better than their own, and the child who is already greater depth then has the ability to verbalize and talk through what a next step might be for that working at the expected standard writer. Would you be the case in any subject?
Yeah, would you ever give it so you give every child in the class the same piece of work, so that you could have it actually someone's work in the class that everyone assesses together?
Yeah, so I've never done it with a child from my own class, just in case they might pick at it. But what I have in terms of pick out whose it is. But what I have done, and we're as you know, Tom, we're a 3-form entry school and 4-form entry in some year groups. So I have gone to one of the other classes and taken work and photocopied it and kind of gone through it to kind of pick it apart, to pick out what's great and what isn't, and done that as an exercise before they would start writing. And then again afterwards, perhaps when they are in that editing stage, I might take one and go, well, here's one that's not edited. Here, what could we do to improve it?
Yeah, okay.
I'm really aware that we spoke about having a secondary school teacher in with geography and history. In terms of this this peer assessment, it would be the same. It's just about really directing it back to the success criteria within your lesson. So apologies, the secondary curriculum, I'm not too familiar with it, but it would be about you being really clear in that planning stage about what would make that piece of work successful, and then making sure that the children are really aware of it. So if I look at the primary writing that I've put up on the board, describing settings and character, using some cohesive devices, you would just be the same with your geographical content or your historical content about what you wanted them to achieve.
Yeah, it would work for that. You just putting in the AO1, AO2, AO3 expectations, and actually I quite like the fact that they need to self-assess their own work first before they pass it on to somebody else, because sometimes I don't think they have the ability to do that. So doing that and then passing it on to somebody else actually will make them think about what they've actually written, because I think they're still not quite clear on what it is.
That self-reflection is almost harder. And what I have noticed is that some of our children who think they've got it all, so some of those children who are aware that they are perhaps working at greater depth, they will just go through and blanket tick.
Yeah.
And actually they perhaps haven't got everything that you would expect them to have perhaps made some basic errors.
I think for some of them as well, I think they don't realise how well they do pick it up, and they do miss it, and they miss it, and the fact that somebody else has picked it up for them makes them relook and revalue their own work, which I think is important, which is why I think peer assessment does work, and that's exactly how it does.
Yeah, just to interject there, I agree. I use this as a plenary about 2/3 of the way through the lesson.
Yeah.
So when I've given them a certain amount of time to do something, I'll say to them, right, now what I want you to do is look through, we call ours planning for peer assessment or a prompt sheet. And I said, right, can you just go through and can you highlight this and this and this where you've actually done this?
Yeah.
And it makes them start thinking. I say, you know, can you, so I say you can't highlight it until you can find it in your work. And actually it works really, really well. And you say definitely for those working at greater depth, it is absolutely brilliant because they know then that they've got to hit it.
Yeah, and these are easily differentiated, so you can see that from on this one I've got working towards the expected standard, working at the expected standard. You can change the wording around that to make children feel more comfortable, but you can alter it so that your children who are perhaps working in a different curriculum, if you've got some children working significantly below, you could pick out features that you know that they need to work on. So if you've got children who are further up in the school, year 6 perhaps, but they're working at a year 2 curriculum, you might pick out some of those year 2 objectives just for them on their personalised sheet when they're doing it for themselves, and get them to work with somebody who would help them look for those features within their writing. And sometimes taking that from a friend, a critical friend, is easier to hear from the teacher that they're always sat there working with, or from the teaching assistant that perhaps they're often working with, and it develops some independence. So if I move on to self-assessment, it's not just a skill for now, but for tomorrow. So when I was doing a little bit of research on this, I was, as I'm sure everyone does, typing into Google about self-assessment, and I came across the University of Exeter's quality of teaching guide, that they like to make sure that all of their programs of study are adhering to. And as you can see, I've taken a quote directly from it. So developing reflective skills provides students with the ability to consider their own performance and to identify their strengths, weaknesses, and areas that require improvement. Students can then use this knowledge to influence their future work, whether on a programme of study or in employment. By playing to their strengths and/or directing their efforts in areas they've already recognised as needing further improvement, you could consider self-assessment as a teaching and learning exercise as much as an assessment method, and its inclusion within a course provides your students with the opportunity to develop a core life learning skill. So that's taken directly from the University of Exeter, and I think it's really important that we think about these skills that we're developing in these children, not just now, but for lifelong learning, and that ability to self-assess and that ability to kind of direct your own learning. I mean, you guys yourselves within your professional career, you've chosen to come on this session, you've identified an area that you perhaps need some improvement on. It's really important that we have that ability to identify in ourselves areas that we need to improve. And I think the earlier that we start teaching those skills, the better our children are, and the better that our learners will be as they head off into their future employment. So I think it's really interesting that the university specifically mention it, and it is something that we need to consider throughout learning. And this is a concept, it's not just important it is just as important in early years as it is in employment. I don't know if we've got anyone in early years here. Self-assessment in early years and peer assessment in early years take on a totally different vein, in that it's about talking to the children about what they've done well and installing a sense of pride, but also about, you know, giving them a suggestion, again in a really helpful way, about what they could do to improve. And obviously their learning objectives and their success criteria are going to be very different to what we look like in Key Stage 2 or in secondary. But again, it would just be about, in that planning stage, really being thoughtful as to what you want them to do. And for them, it might not be written down because they might not be able to read the feedback that a friend gives them. So it's about encouraging those conversations around what they've done well and what they need to improve, and us as adults modelling that, and then also encouraging the children to do it with one another. So during their work, asking them to tell you what they've done really well, and asking them to tell you what they could perhaps do. And admittedly, at their age group, it might be, I need to remember the capital. But I think it's about really encouraging those skills, because they are skills, that ability to be reflective and evaluative of their work. They are skills in their own right. So in terms of self-assessment, I've taken these from Twinkle. Say what you want about Twinkle, there's some good stuff on there. Not everything, but some good stuff.
I still use it, and I'm in secondary,
Yeah.
so you know, for my lower classes, it's brilliant. So
Yeah.
you know, I still use it.
So in terms of, and these are put quite simply from Twinkle. So self-assessment, if I just mute all our lovely faces. So check understanding. There's a difference between acquiring knowledge and truly understanding something, and getting pupils to assess their own response gives us an insight into their actual comprehension. In other words, it can show you what they know as opposed to what they think they know. And you can then use this to close gaps and to help pupils to make better progress. So I'm going to go back to the point that I started with, which is peer and self-assessment is not a free pass. Once they've done it, you either need to have that conversation or review their self-reflection sheet, that tick sheet, that sticker, however you've done it, you need to review it to check whether there needs to be amendments in that journey of learning that you've planned. It can promote independence, help your young learners to become more independent by getting them to identify how they can improve a response to something, no matter what level, subject or topic. Encourage pupils to identify improvements whilst recognising what they've done well. And again, that's a really, really important skill. It can consolidate learning, so it can get pupils to evaluate a previous response to something in the light of new information. This can help remove misconceptions and demonstrate new learning. And that's a really important skill also. It develops evaluative skills, as I've said, and encourages your pupils, encourage your pupils can decide what makes something good or bad, and let them decide the success criteria for a particular piece of work. That perhaps lends itself better to some lessons than others. And this is a higher order thinking skill which can help them make evaluative judgments. It increases engagement by giving people ownership of their learning. You're giving them the opportunity to become more engaged with their learning process. And it develops a deeper understanding by actively engaging with what's good or bad about a particular response. Pupils will have to think much deeper about the criteria used to assess them for that task. In doing so, this can help them to understand much better how to make progress in a specific area. So what I've got on my screen here is I've got a Let's Mark page from a Year 4 writing lesson. So you can see that in pink, because we use pink to pick out the positives, the teachers have identified to the children, so this is up before they start writing, that they need to include temporal conjunctions, imperative verbs, embedded clauses, complex punctuation and adverbs. They've also highlighted, as I said was important, the things that they might get wrong. So sentences that don't make sense, incorrectly used temporal conjunctions, a lack of imperative verbs, and instructions not being ordered. So it's really important that you're clear over the potential errors, and this will avoid the generic, it could have been neater comment that a lot of people put. So our feedback policy means that children have to work with the teacher to feedback, and they are often identifying their own areas of strength. So I've taken a picture of a piece of writing there, and I believe that's a Year 2 piece. So you can see straight down the side there that they've got things that they've highlighted that they've done particularly well. And that, as you can see, they've highlighted in green what they need to improve. They have literally put improve in the margin, but what they have done also is they've actually improved it in blue pen, and that closes that loop. So once they've assessed their work themselves, they close that loop. They do the thing that helps them improve. Now, I know that we spoke about using it at the end of a lesson or as a mini plenary just before, and that's really, really powerful. I was teaching the other day with a group of Year 5s, and we were talking about, they were writing a how-to guide on how to keep mentally healthy. And every 10 minutes I was stopping them going, who's included this? Who's included that? Who's included one of the things that we shared as a class? And as we were doing it, we were picking off all the steps to success. And that if they were able to spot it in their own work, they could highlight it and write what they'd done well in the margin. And then I said to them, if you haven't included it yet, is there somewhere in your work already where that could go? And could you put that in blue pen and an asterisk, a little star, and then write that sentence that you could include? Or could you include it further on? So using this throughout the lesson and getting them to self-assess against that criteria throughout the lesson helps the children develop that evaluative skill, but also helps them to address the misconceptions in their learning straight away. And the sooner you address a misconception, the better, because obviously the less misconceptions of that same nature that you'll get throughout. I've got a lot of grids up here of work that I've used before with children. So Tom, I know I said that the toolkit in the book where the child has actually completed it. It's quite a vast toolkit, and obviously the writing, the primary writing project, the toolkits get a little bit more developed the further up the school. And also I can see that from this one, they've also included a few elements because it's a year 5 class. So they've also included some of the elements from the Working Towards Teacher Assessment Framework from year 6, so that we get those covered up. But you can see that the child, apologies, has gone through and ticked what they have done well. In the past, we've used feedback stickers, and in the past I've made the stickers be little self-assessment grids. So date and dear diary needed to be included on a diary, written in the first person, great adverbials, adjectives, paragraphs, and then a little step for the goal for next time. Again, all of these include key elements, and where I can, I've been quite explicit. So if I, on this one, for example, have got capital letters and full stops for the beginning and the end of sentences, along with proper nouns. I've been quite specific. And again, this is one of those examples where they've looked for it, and then I've said whether I agree with it or not. So it's really, it's a really lovely way of being able to spot for themselves. Again, these success criteria will all have been displayed on the board, and all will have been talked through in the same way that these have, so that the children are really aware of what they're looking for. And it then falls into that planning and preparation kind of process that you go through. So some more information on self-assessment. If you were still wondering if self-assessment can be effective, it helps pupils to reflect and self-correct throughout the lesson, not just at the end. It enables immediate feedback so that pupils can start improving straight away, which inevitably means you're not going to get a whole page of errors, because I've been there. Self-assessment helps pupils to develop higher order evaluative skills. Links back to that Bloom's kind of taxonomy, and that kind of really thinking about the questions that they're asking of one another and of themselves. Pupils have to reflect honestly, so it also builds integrity. Self-assessment in itself provides another learning opportunity. Again, it becomes a tool in its own right. As pupils need to know the success criteria well, it offers potentially deeper learning. And again, building it with them. So when you're in that planning stage and you've got these up, it might be that you have these up to start with, but then through your natural dialogue through the lesson, you've included other things that you want them to have, and you can include that in your list additionally. It can help pupils keep a track of their progress. Formative self-assessment takes attention away from levels and grades. That's less so in primary. I'm not sure how it stands in secondary, but I know that we don't necessarily level or grade a piece of work, other than perhaps in year 6 where we talk about it being the expected standard. And then it promotes autonomous learning, and that the greater independence that we can give the children in looking at what makes a great piece of work, the better. Anyone got any questions on that before I move on? Or perhaps questions on any of those examples?
I think that's really helpful, Hannah, to see lots of all different examples and things. It's really nice to see it, and especially to see the pictures of your books and things like that. It's really helpful.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I will, I'm not sure if my email is at the end, but I'm happy to share my email with you all at the end of the session, and you're more than welcome to get in touch, and we can share good practice across. I think the more we get out and see things, particularly with self-assessment and peer assessment, and see it kind of live in action, the better. Because certainly how it looks in, as I said, early years would be different to how it looks further up the school, and then would be slightly different further up with regards to secondary. So to finish, it kind of comes back to the importance behind it all. So if I don't know if any of you ever heard of it before, but the Education Endowment Foundation identify the most effective ways of supporting children to make progress within learning. They've got this massive teaching toolkit, and it's a long list of things that include things like use of TAs, comprehension tasks, keeping children back a year, and all the different things that you can do in order to help a child make progress. They arrange the list based on effectiveness in terms of impact in months, evidence, strength, it's all based on research, and cost. And you can arrange this list however you like. And I always go for the ones that make the best impact. Because if you're looking to help your children make progress, that's what you want. So top of the list is metacognition and self-regulation. And the EEF describe metacognition and self-regulation as approaches to teaching that support pupils to think about their own learning more explicitly, often by teaching them specific strategies for planning, monitoring, and evaluating their learning. Interventions are usually designed to give pupils a repertoire of strategies to choose from and the skills to select the most suitable strategy for the given task. I think that really comes into teaching them about self-assessment and peer assessment and looking critically at their own learning, that strategies for planning and monitoring and evaluating their learning. And actually, it really is quite simple in practice. You know, these tick sheets, they don't take long. The depth behind it is you knowing your curriculum and you knowing exactly what you want for the children to have achieved, and then giving them time to do that. And it does take time and it does take training. You know, the first time I gave a group of children a pink highlighter, they wanted to highlight everything on the page pink. But it's about talking to them about what are they explicitly highlighting? What do I want to see? What skills? You know, I don't, you know, in a year 6, a capital letter highlighted. I think we're beyond that. I would like to see, please, the use of passive voice highlighted, for example. But that is the most effective skill that we can give our children to make impact in terms of progress, in terms of months, and that makes 7 months additional progress. Fourth on the list is feedback. So within their findings from research, the EEF identify that feedback can come from a variety of sources. Studies have shown positive effects of feedback from teachers and peers. Now, there's a huge amount of research, both on metacognition and self-regulation and on feedback within the teacher toolkit. And I would recommend spending some time around that website and having a little look at some of the suggestions that they make. But those are number 1 and number 4 on a list of things that are effective at making huge chunks of progress. So 7 months and 6 months. And the cost is low. It's that, you know, there's one pound sign there. That's low cost, high effect. And both of them have a good chunk of evidence to support that. And not only can I see it from this toolkit and this list, but I've seen it in books and in practice. So I really do believe in it as a skill. And it does come back to making sure that you know your curriculum and you're planning for the opportunities for it. And that is the end of my presentation.